I'm left with the feeling that what it really exposes is, and what remains the terrible problem with the United States, is the huge lingering legacy of slavery and the resentment of a large part of the population towards another large part of the population because of that, and the resulting, what always seemed to me to be, perverse verdict of the jury. I think most of us who've looked into what happened, have seen the evidence, have looked at as I say, the dramatizations of it, would come to the conclusion that he was guilty of the crime of which he was charged. But undoubtedly respectable, sensible, intelligent black people, citizens of the United States, wouldn't convict him on that. And I think this speaks much more about the huge division in that country than it speaks about his guilt.
There was a jury in that criminal trial, of course, and they acquitted OJ Simpson. Polling at the time is interesting because it sort of leans into the public perception of the case. I can't, comment on the actual trial itself, but most black Americans regarded Simpson as a victim of racism, while more than half of white Americans considered him guilty.
Well, exactly. And what do you do about that? And I'm a great supporter of the jury system, of the presumption of innocence, of the power of juries to refuse to do what prosecutors and judges want them to do. And therefore I can't really say that I'm against the fact that the jury had the freedom to do this. I think the significant thing remains that we simply aren't, particularly in this country, anything like as aware as we should be of the profound division that still remains so many years afterwards, caused by slavery in the United States and the effect that it has on people's minds. I say these jurors who acquitted OJ Simpson were not fools. For my own part, I would guess that they probably knew perfectly well what the evidence said, but they weren't going to convict him. And that was that. And you have to learn something from that, however much you disapprove of it and dislike it as a result. You have to learn something from it about the state of the world's most powerful country. What is astonishing is to sit through the whole thing, and one can sit through it again now, looking at everything that happened, and say, here is this huge amount of very persuasive evidence that a man has committed what I have to say was a particularly horrible crime. If you go into the details of it, the extreme violence used is shocking. And yet, despite how that must have disgusted and angered people, they still felt it was more important to make the political point of what was basically a political acquittal than to convict him. And that lingers with me. A lot of my quite brief experience in the United States drove home to me again and again and again how we, looking at it from over here, we are not anything like as aware as we should be of how that country remains deeply racially divided. Washington, D.C., the city on the fringes of which I lived, is itself profoundly racially divided to this day. There is, in the United States, in some ways, more apartheid than there ever was in South Africa, but it's accepted because of the strange way in which it's enforced by wealth, mainly, and people don't go on. But here was this person who had apparently committed this terrible crime, who nonetheless was acquitted, say, by a jury, and a lot of people on that jury must have been intelligent and thoughtful people, and yet they did that. That remains to me the most shocking and powerful thing of the whole O.J. Simpson case. And I can't get over it. This still lingers years and years later, and will linger, I think, for many, many decades to come, as a crucial feature of the United States, and something that, as I say, an awful lot of outsiders simply don't realize how deep it goes.
Yeah. It did cement also the popularity of televised trials. It had come in the early 80s, I think, in the US, but the 95 million Americans, including you, Peter, who tuned into the trial, the criminal trial of O.J. Simpson, meant that it became incredibly popular. And I think every court now has TV installed, and we've seen, from later cases like Depp versus Heard, just what entertainment value there is.
Well, the channel Court TV, which became very popular at that time, made a very strong point in its own self-advertising. I remember saying American courtrooms were built big. they would say. The whole idea of American justice was that it should be seen by as many people as possible. And you couldn't really argue against that. Though I did also attend a bizarre trial, which was partly televised. You may remember the appalling, the appalling Bobbitt case, where a woman removed her
husband's penis,
male organ.
Yeah.
And one of them was tried on TV, and one of them was not for technical reasons I won't go into. And the total difference between the two trials in Virginia, because one was televised and one wasn't, made the other point, which is that television changes justice in so many ways for the worst by making people play to the cameras. Why, ever since, if anyone's ever suggested bringing in televised trials here, I've always been against it, because it plainly does change the way in which people behave in court. Everybody. Not just the defendant, not just the witnesses, but everybody.
Percentage-wise, in OJ Simpson's case, Peter, how many were, interested in seeing the path of justice done, and how many were rubbernecking?
Well, I think a lot of people were doing both, and I think they're not mutually exclusive. But what worries me about the televised trials, apart from anything else, is the increasing way in which prosecutions are very selectively done. I mean, certainly in our system, huge numbers of cases never actually get to be prosecuted properly. They're arranged in other ways. People plead guilty at the last minute. Those trials, often major trials, where we have a prosecutor in many cases doesn't have very much evidence and is inclined to make a great play out of the horror of the crime to cover up for the fact that he doesn't actually have very much forensic work which would establish that the defendant has done the crime. I think television would tend to increase that for a start. And I think it's a grave danger in our system, because our courts are crumbling, because there are enormous delays, because the prisons are full, so the pressure is on judges not to send people to prison because the police are packing
and there's
up.
A huge barrister shortage as well.
If you have televised criminal trials, and of course, once you start even televising the summing up, that's obviously intended to lead people on to the televising of the rest. Once you have televised criminal trials, as it were, the politicization of trials, and of course these other rather alarming developments, the victim statements which now take place, which again emotionalize the courtroom, and the whole point of an English courtroom was always to de-emotionalize it, so that the court could actually examine the thing properly as with the evidence and nothing else. And if you bring in the emotional power of TV cameras, you'll lose that, and you'll lose a lot of justice as well, I think.
Yeah.